The 1970s marked a decisive turning point in global entheogenic history, as the extraordinary psychedelic expansion of the 1960s collided with prohibition, cultural backlash, and the retreat of institutional research. Yet, beneath this apparent suppression, entheogenic knowledge continued to evolve through underground networks, scientific inquiry, academic scholarship, and the preservation of indigenous wisdom and shamanic rites. From 1970 to 1979, entheogenic history entered a period of profound contraction following the rapid expansion of psychedelic research and counterculture during the previous decade. The United States Controlled Substances Act of 1970 placed LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, and several related compounds into Schedule I, severely restricting legitimate research and transforming the legal environment surrounding entheogens. Despite prohibition, underground psychedelic communities continued to develop, preserving experiential knowledge while increasingly connecting entheogenic practice with Eastern spirituality, indigenous shamanism, occultism, psychology, and alternative approaches to consciousness. The decade also witnessed an important expansion of ethnographic and historical interest in traditional entheogenic practices, particularly through scholarship concerning indigenous cultures of the Americas and their ceremonial use of psychoactive plants and fungi. R. Gordon Wasson's earlier work continued to influence researchers and seekers, while the publication and circulation of works such as Carlos Castaneda's writings helped popularize ideas about visionary plants, although many of Castaneda's ethnographic claims remain highly contested. Scientific research did not disappear entirely, and investigators continued studying psychedelics in areas including psychotherapy, perception, neurochemistry, and the phenomenology of altered states, often under considerable institutional and legal constraints. The decade also produced influential literature connecting psychedelics with mystical experience, ecology, Eastern philosophy, mythology, and the study of consciousness, helping preserve the intellectual continuity of the psychedelic tradition during Prohibition. By the middle and late 1970s, organizations and researchers devoted to psychedelic scholarship began laying foundations for a future revival, while underground networks maintained practical knowledge that formal institutions could no longer easily transmit. Globally, the period therefore represented less an end to entheogenic history than a transformation from highly visible public experimentation toward underground practice, ethnobotanical scholarship, spiritual exploration, and increasingly international perspectives. Towards the end of the decade, scholars conceived the word entheogen, referring to visionary plants and fungi with the capacity to generate the divine within, shifting public and academic discourse away from words like psychedelic and hallucinogen, which had become problematic due to recreational and pathological assumptions. By 1979, the central legacy of the decade was the preservation and reinterpretation of entheogenic knowledge, creating intellectual, scientific, and cultural foundations that would contribute significantly to the renewed psychedelic research and public interest of the 1980s, 1990s, and beyond. Before we begin, I want to take a moment and thank our monthly members. You help to fuel the enlightening education that benefits many around the world. Your support enables S.E.E.K to continue creating content, providing a path for all spiritual seekers. Support us with a monthly membership on YouTube, Patreon, or Ko-Fi at Join S.E.E.K, or on Facebook at Join S.E.E.K1. Become a member and you will see your name in future videos. Thank you. To understand the 70s, we have to look beyond the image of the fading hippie era. The period witnessed a renewed turn toward indigenous shamanism, Asian contemplative disciplines, pagan revival, consciousness research, and comparative religious scholarship. In 1970, the counterculture's mystical inheritance was already being reorganized into more durable networks. Some people looked toward Zen, Tibetan Buddhism, Hindu yoga, Sufism, Kabbalah, Western ceremonial magic, alchemy, astrology, neo-paganism, and Christian mysticism, asking whether psychedelic revelation confirmed teachings about ego death, non-duality, gnosis, illumination, or the soul's journey. Others turned toward what they understood as shamanism, a broad, frequently imprecise label for ritual specialists who mediate among human, animal, ancestral, and spirit worlds through song, trance, dream, ordeal, healing, and altered states. That turn was shaped by anthropological writing, popular books, and travelers' reports, but it also generated serious problems of cultural appropriation, because discrete indigenous spiritual systems were often blended into an imagined universal shamanic past. In Amazonian context, for example, ayahuasca, also called yaje in some regions, was not simply a chemical mixture, but part of living systems of vegetal knowledge, diagnosis, purification, dietary discipline, song, and relations with plant and animal spirits. The common brew combines Banisteriopsis caapi, a vine containing beta-carboline MAO inhibitors, with DMT containing plants like Psychotria viridis in many preparations. Its ritual meanings and ingredients, however, vary by community and region. General claims about ancient uniform practices should be treated cautiously because the relevant traditions are diverse, adaptive, and historically specific. Peyote likewise remained inseparable from the religious sovereignty of the Native American Church, where it functioned in all-night ceremonial settings involving prayer, song, moral instruction, healing, and community responsibility. The Native American Church had developed in the Oklahoma Territory toward the end of the 19th century and helped communities preserve spiritual autonomy amid dispossession, coercive assimilation, and the trauma of boarding school systems. In this setting, peyote was not evidence for a generic New Age philosophy. It was a sacrament within Native religious life. The continuing existence of the Native American Church also demonstrated something crucial for the coming decades. Entheogenic religion was not only an experimental phenomenon of the 1960s, but an enduring institution rooted in the history of indigenous peoples. At the same time, Mexican Huicharika communities, often called Huichol in older sources, continued peyote pilgrimages and ceremonial observances connected to their own sacred landscape and cosmology, not to an outsider's search for exotic spiritual experience. Peyote's documented sacramental history in Mesoamerica extends deeply into the past, while its modern legal and religious debates became increasingly consequential in North America. These living spiritual systems challenged the assumption that spirituality could be separated from collective duty, land, law, kinship, and memory. By the start of the 1970s, entheogenic culture was no longer only preserving the memories of the psychedelic 60s. It was creating a new intellectual map in which ancient mysteries, contemporary sacramental religions, clinical healing, and botanical knowledge could be discussed under a shared, if disputed, language. In 1970, the publication of John M. Allegro's The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross created one of the decade's most controversial entheogenic arguments. Allegro, a scholar of Semitic languages associated with the Dead Sea Scrolls project, proposed that early Christianity had concealed a mushroom-centered fertility cult, and that elements of Christian language encoded references to psychoactive fungi. His thesis received sharp rejection from many classicists, biblical scholars, linguists, and historians of religion. It should not be presented as established history, yet the book mattered culturally because it gave many readers permission to ask whether the Eucharist, the fruit in the Garden of Eden, the Israelite manna, the Vedic soma, the mystery religions of Greece and Rome, and sacred plants might share a hidden visionary substrate. The question was larger than Allegro's particular claims. Could religious symbols preserve memories of altered states, even after the original ritual technologies had been forgotten or prohibited? Researchers and writers approached that question through comparative mythology, philology, ethnobotany, archaeology, iconography, and folklore, though each form of evidence required different standards of proof. A mushroom-shaped image, for example, does not by itself demonstrate ritual ingestion. A textual allusion might be metaphorical, and a pharmacologically active plant does not automatically establish a religious function. Still, the appeal of these theories reflected a deep longing in post-60s spiritual culture. For spiritual seekers alienated from institutional religion, an entheogenic interpretation promised that revelation might once have been immediate, embodied, and available through nature, rather than mediated solely by clergy or doctrine. This was a modern form of perennialism, the belief that many religions conceal a common core of mystical experience. It could encourage cross-cultural curiosity, but it could also flatten historical differences and turn living spiritual systems into raw material for a universal spiritual narrative. The most responsible approach holds both insights together. Human cultures have repeatedly used techniques of ecstasy and altered awareness, but no single theory can dissolve the particularity of Jewish, Christian, Greek, Vedic, Mesoamerican, Amazonian, or indigenous North American religious worlds. By the early 1970s, another major current was taking shape: the spiritualization of psychology. The question was no longer only what do visions mean, but whether experiences of unity, terror, death, or transcendence could be understood as stages of human development. Harvard psychologist Richard Alpert transformed into Ram Dass in 1967 when a trip to India led him to meet his guru Neem Karoli Baba. The spiritual master gave him the name Ram Dass, which means servant of God, marking his rebirth from a dismissed Harvard psychologist into a global spiritual teacher. Ram Dass's 1971 classic book, Be Here Now, originally titled From Bindu to Ojas, transformed entheogenic history by pivoting the American counterculture from chemical hedonism to disciplined inner awareness. Ram Dass argued that entheogens could open the door to divine consciousness, but you could not stay inside. His famous anecdote of giving massive doses of LSD to his guru Neem Karoli Baba, who remained entirely unaffected, proved that higher states could be embodied naturally without a pill. By framing psychedelics as temporary tickets rather than permanent arrivals, Richard Alpert shifted the psychedelic movement toward meditation, yoga, and lifelong spiritual integration. The book redirected psychonauts toward sustainable practices like breathwork, mantra, and service. Dr. Andrew Weil's 1972 landmark book, The Natural Mind, revolutionized entheogenic and drug history by arguing that the human drive to alter awareness is an innate, normal biological need. Rather than viewing psychoactive sacraments as dangerous alien chemicals or medical pathology, Weil framed entheogens as natural catalysts for accessing higher, non-rational states of awareness. He proposed that humans possess an inherent urge to periodically step outside normal, rational thinking, and argued that drugs do not create highs magically. They merely unlock neurological pathways already present in the human mind. This shifted academic and cultural dialogue away from pure criminalization toward anthropology and consciousness exploration. Stanislav Grof became another key figure in this transition, carrying forward psychedelic psychotherapy after official research channels constricted. Earlier clinical work with LSD had led Grof to develop a cartography of what he called the perinatal and transpersonal dimensions of consciousness, experiential realms that could include reliving birth, confronting death, encountering archetypal imagery, or identifying with forms of life beyond the individual ego. His language drew from psychiatry, depth psychology, mythology, and ancient spiritual systems, helping form what would become transpersonal psychology. Rather than reducing intense states to illness, this framework proposed that some crises might be spiritual emergencies, destabilizing but potentially transformative processes when met with skilled support. In 1974, Stanislav and Christina Grof began developing holotropic breathwork, a non-drug practice using accelerated breathing, evocative music, bodywork when consented to, and structured integration in an effort to access states resembling psychedelic experience. The practice reflected a larger adaptation of the post-prohibition era. When access to psychedelics became legally dangerous, communities sought other routes to ecstasy, catharsis, trance, and visionary consciousness. Breath, drumming, chanting, fasting, sensory overload, dance, meditation, and ritual theater could all be framed as technologies of the sacred. Such techniques also connected contemporary seekers to older ascetic and ecstatic lineages, from yogic pranayama and Buddhist meditation to Pentecostal worship, Sufi remembrance, Siberian-style drum trance, and Dionysian imagery. Those similarities should not erase their differences. Stanislav Grof's 1975 book, Realms of the Human Unconscious, revolutionized entheogenic history by providing the first comprehensive cartography of non-ordinary states of awareness. Based on 17 years of clinical LSD research, it bridged ancient shamanic systems and modern psychiatry, established transpersonal psychology, and explained the deep psychological roots of mystical experiences. The text served as the cornerstone text for founding a new psychological branch that treats psychedelic states as valid tools for healing rather than psychosis. The era's spiritual marketplace often treated all paths as interchangeable, while more careful practitioners began to recognize the need for historical context and ethical humility. Psychedelic spirituality was thus moving into an era of synthesis. Clinical concepts met occult language, ecological concern met visionary experience, and inherited religions met individual experimentation. It was not a unified movement, but a constellation of overlapping communities trying to determine whether altered awareness offered liberation, delusion, healing, revelation, or all of these at once. While arguments about lost Western sacraments gathered attention, living entheogenic spiritual systems in the Americas continued to demonstrate that visionary religion was not merely ancient history. In Brazil, ayahuasca-centered communities offering disciplined ceremonial frameworks contrasted sharply against individualist experimentation often associated with the counterculture. Santo Daime, founded in the Brazilian Amazon during the early 20th century through the revelations of Raimundo Erenu Serra, combined ayahuasca, called Daime within this framework, with elements of Catholic devotion, Afro-Brazilian religiosity, Amazonian vegetalismo, esoteric Christianity, moral discipline, sacred song, and communal ritual. Its ceremonies, commonly known as works, emphasized prayer, hymns, dance, uniform, concentration, service, and ethical transformation. Here, the visionary brew was not treated simply as a vehicle for private visions. It was understood as a sacrament and teacher, embedded in a collective cosmology of healing and spiritual development. The União do Vegetal, or UDV, was founded in 1961 by José Gabriel de Costa, known to members as Mestre Gabriel, and also placed ayahuasca, often called Huasca in that community, at the center of a structured religious life. Members of the UDV consume ayahuasca sacramentally on the premise that it occasions religious experience, a practice that would later become central to major legal debates in the United States. Though Santo Daime and the UDV shared an Amazonian ayahuasca foundation, they differed in liturgy, organization, theology, ritual style, and institutional culture. Their development reminds us that ayahuasca shamanism is not a single spiritual system, and that ayahuasca itself cannot be separated from the many indigenous, mestizo, Afro-Brazilian, and syncretic histories that have shaped its use. In the same period, Western visitors increasingly traveled to Latin America seeking healers, brews, mushrooms, peyote, and visionary initiation. Some traveled with respect and long-term commitment, while others approached communities through a consumer logic that anticipated later psychedelic tourism. This encounter produced new translations between worlds: curandero, curandera, vegetalista, brujo, icaros, dieta, purge, spirit possession, extraction, and soul loss entered the vocabulary of seekers who often only partly understood their meanings. The resulting spiritual exchange was creative but asymmetrical, shaped by differences in wealth, mobility, race, state power, and access to land. Traditions involving sacred plants carry systems of responsibility and relationship, not just techniques for producing extraordinary states. Within the framework of anthropology and philosophy, several authors made key contributions to the literary world. These scholars made entheogenic education accessible to the general public and encouraged direct experiential knowledge of sacramental entheogen use. Michael J. Harner's 1973 work, Hallucinogens and Shamanism, enriched entheogenic history by bridging rigorous anthropology with direct experiential accounts of plant medicines. By detailing his own initiation with Amazonian ayahuasca, Harner challenged academic dismissal of psychotropics as mere superstition, reframing them as valid technologies for accessing non-ordinary realities and shaping global awareness of shamanic spiritual systems. Harner argued that anthropologists failed to understand indigenous cosmologies because they refused to ingest the plants themselves. His work encouraged researchers to undergo the subjective experience firsthand. The anthology unified diverse global practices, from Amazonian vine usage to Mesoamerican mushroom cults, creating a foundational framework that prefigured modern academic and clinical interest in psychedelics. Terence and Dennis McKenna's 1975 book, The Invisible Landscape: Mind, Hallucinogens, and the I Ching, profoundly impacted entheogenic history by bridging Amazonian shamanism, holographic theories of mind, and esoteric numerology. It proposed that mind-altering plants map a hidden, biologically real hyperspace, influencing modern counterculture philosophies, theories of human consciousness evolution, and archaic ritual revivals. The book chronicled the brothers' 1971 Amazonian expedition, where an experimental vocalization technique with high-dose psilocybin and ayahuasca allegedly sought to forge a hyperdimensional DNA state. By treating plants and fungi like psilocybe mushrooms and ayahuasca as active, non-human intelligence teachers rather than recreational drugs, it shifted counterculture discourse toward ecological and archaic spirituality. While heavily critiqued by mathematicians and viewed by scientists as speculative or fringe, it inspired generations of psychonauts to map inner space with the same fervor once reserved for outer space exploration. Published in 1976 under the pseudonyms O.T. Oss and O.N. Orick, revealed to be brothers Terence and Dennis McKenna, who wanted to appear before Jonathan Ott in hallucinogenic or psychedelic manuals. The book Psilocybin Magic Mushroom Grower's Guide revolutionized entheogenic history. It provided the first reliable, accessible home cultivation method for Psilocybe cubensis mushrooms using ordinary kitchen tools, effectively democratizing psychedelics outside laboratories or traditional indigenous ceremonies. The text moved the psychedelic movement away from synthetic drugs like LSD toward organic, self-grown entheogens, and framed the mushroom not just as a drug, but as a sentient galactic teacher and partner in human evolution. This inspired a decentralized spread of cultivation knowledge that mirrored the very mycelial networks the authors wrote about. Author Robert Anton Wilson also shaped entheogenic history during this period by shifting psychedelic culture away from 1960s utopianism into postmodern pragmatism. Through works like the Illuminatus trilogy from 1975 and Cosmic Trigger from 1977, he taught readers to treat reality maps flexibly, blending altered states with information theory, chaos, and quantum psychology. As the initial psychedelic dream fractured into political disillusionment, Wilson provided a toolkit for navigating cognitive overload and paranoia without losing one's mind. His core philosophical goal was to induce a state of radical skepticism toward all fixed belief systems, including conventional reality and absolute conspiracy. The entheogenic imagination of the 1970s did not only live in ceremonies, books, or underground therapeutic rooms. It also found a home in paint, music, cinema, and television. In the 1970s, psychedelic music evolved from the colorful acid rock of the 1960s into deeper, atmospheric, and progressive soundscapes. Funkadelic, led by George Clinton, melted heavy rock guitar distortion with deep funk grooves, best heard on the 10-minute guitar solo title track of Maggot Brain from 1971. Also in 1971, Sly and the Family Stone transformed R&B with the dark heavy grooves of There's a Riot Going On. Pink Floyd mastered ambient, mind-expanding sound design with albums like Metal in 1971 and The Dark Side of the Moon in 1973. Led Zeppelin helped transition late 1960s counterculture and psychedelic textures into 1970s hard rock and heavy metal. Reggae and dub similarly contributed deep bass, repetition, echo, and spiritual political consciousness, while artists associated with Rastafari situated cannabis within a distinct sacramental and anti-colonial religious framework, rather than a generic counterculture fantasy. Visionary art gave form to experiences that were difficult to name: ego dissolution, erotic divinity, ancestral memory, cosmic anatomy, metamorphosis, and the sense that matter itself might be alive with spirit. Mati Klarwein was among the period's most consequential visual artists because his paintings carried psychedelic and sacred imagery into mass musical culture, without reducing it to a simple poster aesthetic. His work fused surrealism, Renaissance-like compositional density, erotic symbolism, cross-cultural religious references, African and Asian visual motifs, and dreamlike transformations of the human figure. In 1970, Carlos Santana used Klarwein's 1961 painting, The Annunciation, on the cover of his album Abraxas, helping make an image of ecstatic feminine sacredness, hybrid symbolism, and visionary color inseparable from one of the era's defining albums. That same year, Miles Davis used Klarwein's imagery for his album Bitches Brew, a landmark of electric jazz, whose dense improvisational sound world paralleled the painter's crowded metamorphic visual universe. Klarwein also created cover art for Davis's Live Evil in 1971, extending a relationship in which album packaging became more than commercial design. It was an initiatory threshold into music presented as psychological, erotic, ancestral, and otherworldly. In this sense, the record sleeve became a portable visionary object. Before the digital age, listeners physically handled such images, studied them while music played, and entered an audiovisual environment where jazz fusion, psychedelic rock, funk, ambient experimentation, and sacred art could meet. Klarwein's later 1970s inscapes, his name for inward-looking landscape-like images, also appeared in collaborations with trumpeter John Hassell on Brian Eno's ambient label. The term inscape captured a central entheogenic intuition. Inner experience can possess landscapes, weather, beings, and architecture, as compelling as the outer world. Klarwein's art did not document a single religion or pharmacological experience. Rather, it created an imaginal zone where Tantra, Christianity, African diasporic visual resonances, Hindu and Buddhist motifs, erotic mysticism, and psychedelic dream merged. That creative fusion was influential, but it also illustrates a recurring tension in 70s visionary culture. Universal spiritual synthesis could open imaginative bridges while sometimes detaching symbols from their specific histories and living communities. If Klarwein made visionary imagery circulate through popular music, Ernst Fuchs represented a deeper bridge between European sacred art, esoteric symbolism, and the emerging category of visionary painting. His work showed that the psychedelic era did not invent the sacred image from nothing. It reactivated older currents of alchemy, Christian mysticism, mythology, and fantastic realism. Ernst Fuchs, an Austrian artist and co-founder of the Vienna School of Fantastic Realism, worked across painting, drawing, printmaking, sculpture, architecture, stage design, poetry, and music. Fantastic realism combined technical precision influenced by old master painting with symbolic, dreamlike, erotic, religious, and mythological content. In Fuchs's hands, the sacred body could appear simultaneously Byzantine, alchemical, Gothic, Baroque, and Futurist. Ornate, wounded, luminous, and charged with archetypal significance. His visual language resonated with esoteric spiritual systems that treat the image as a vehicle of contemplation. The Kabbalistic tree of life, alchemical conjunctio or rectification of opposites, Christian incarnation, sacred marriage, angelic hierarchy, and transformation of base matter into spiritual gold, all supplied conceptual parallels for viewers seeking a metaphysics of metamorphosis. Fuchs was not simply a psychedelic artist, and reducing him to that label would obscure his distinctive lineage in post-war European art and sacred symbolism. But his meticulous visions helped establish a visual vocabulary that later artists and audiences associated with altered states, spiritual transformation, and transpersonal consciousness. He also served as a teacher and influence within visionary art networks. Accounts of his legacy identify Matti Klarwein and Robert Venosa among artists connected to his instruction. In 1972, Fuchs acquired the Otto Wagner Villa in Vienna's Hütteldorf district and transformed it over time into what would become the Ernst Fuchs Museum, inaugurated in 1988. The site itself reflected a quintessentially esoteric artistic ambition. Art was not confined to a canvas, but could become an immersive environment, a total symbolic world, almost a temple of the imagination. In this respect, Fuchs's legacy converged with the entheogenic interest in set and setting. A visionary image, a ritual room, a concert stage, or an architectural interior could all help shape the interpretive frame through which unusual consciousness was encountered. The decade also marked the formative emergence of Alex Grey and other visionary artists, whose later work would become among the most recognizable visual languages of contemporary entheogenic spirituality. During the 1970s, Alex Grey was not yet the widely known painter of cosmic anatomy, yet the experiences and experiments that would inform his mature work were already underway. Alex Grey studied art at Columbus College from 1972 to 1974 and at Tufts University from 1974 to 1975, where he met his future wife and artistic collaborator Alison Grey. During the 1970s and 80s, he created performances and sculptural installations grounded in his visionary experiences, while his work with human cadavers at a medical school morgue deepened his study of physical anatomy. That unusual conjunction, direct encounter with bodily mortality alongside meditation, chant, dance, psychedelic exploration, and spiritual inquiry, became essential to Grey's visual theology. In 1976, Alex and Alison Grey reported a shared visionary experience that each later painted in their distinct styles, an event Alex regarded as confirmation of an underlying unity of consciousness. Grey has described his first LSD experience at that time as a decisive spiritual turning point, transforming what he characterized as agnostic existentialism into a radical sense of transcendence. By 1979, he had begun the Sacred Mirrors, the series that would take roughly a decade to complete and eventually present the human being as layers of physical, energetic, psychic, and universal reality. Grey's emerging iconography made the body transparent rather than merely exposed. Muscles, organs, nerves, chakras, auras, thought forms, and radiant networks became interpenetrating dimensions of a single being. This vision connected Western anatomical illustration with Hindu and Buddhist subtle body imagery, Christian halos, theosophical aura diagrams, and the transpersonal psychology of the era. It also made an entheogenic proposition visually accessible. Ordinary perception may show only one layer of reality. The importance of Grey's 70s work lies in its insistence that visionary art was not escapist fantasy. For him, it was a disciplined attempt to make visible what altered states, contemplative practice, intimacy, death awareness, and ecstatic experience suggested about consciousness. Around these artists gathered a wider visionary constellation. Their paintings, drawings, posters, stage environments, and album art gave the spiritual underground images through which it could recognize itself. Robert Venosa, who studied with Ernst Fuchs and later became a major figure in visionary art, developed intricately rendered worlds of biomorphic forms, cosmic interiors, luminous entities, and surreal metamorphosis. His influence became especially important as visionary art matured beyond the looser, poster-based psychedelia of the 1960s into technically meticulous imaginal realism. H.R. Geiger, though not reducible to entheogenic culture, brought biomechanical eroticism, dread, and technological mutation into the period's visual unconscious. His work suggested a darker counterpart to the organic, earth-centered spirituality common to the period's visionary art. The art of the 70s often moved between these two poles, nature as sacred intelligence and technology as alienating or invasive force. Artists such as Roger Dean made album covers into impossible landscapes of floating islands, organic architecture, planetary oceans, and otherworldly habitats, especially through his work with the progressive rock band Yes. His imagery offered viewers a non-verbal cosmology in which music became a journey through alternate worlds. At the same time, underground comics, concert posters, light shows, experimental animation, and occult illustration continued to circulate images of mandalas, serpents, eyes, mushrooms, astral bodies, Hindu deities, tarot archetypes, and spiraling geometry. These motifs were not proof that their creators used entheogens, nor were they all tied to one doctrine. They were part of a shared visual language for representing expansion, interconnection, inner travel, and the breakdown of ordinary categories. The era's films offered parallel images of altered reality. Through midnight movies like El Topo and The Holy Mountain, Alejandro Jodorowsky mapped inner ego dissolution, occult symbolism, and spiritual awakening onto global cinema. Jodorowsky's 1973 cult classic, The Holy Mountain, codified the shift from 1960s chemical hedonism to rigorous occult-infused entheogenic spirituality, staging alchemical, tarot-like, anti-materialist visions. The Chilean-French director impacted global entheogenic and counterculture history by translating the phenomenology of the psychedelic experience into visual language. By mapping ego death, ritualistic plant and psychedelic use, and esoteric systems onto celluloid, the film became a visual blueprint for modern esoteric counterculture and psychotherapeutic cinema. Jodorowsky structured the cinematic narrative around psychological disintegration and reintegration, mirroring high-dose psychedelic and entheogenic breakthroughs. Cast members underwent months of isolation, meditation, and guided hallucinogenic and shamanic rituals to induce genuine altered states before shooting. The film captured the ineffable, truth-revealing sensation characteristic of classic entheogens, bridging the gap between surrealist fiction and perceived metaphysical reality. Nicholas Roeg's film, The Man Who Fell to Earth in 1976, turned alienation, addiction, and perception into a hallucinatory cinematic experience. In the same decade, Stanley Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange and George Lucas's Star Wars also helped popularize radically stylized worlds of psychological control, mythic initiation, cosmic force, and technological destiny, even though they were not specifically entheogenic scripts. On television, Carl Sagan's Cosmos began in 1980, and therefore belongs just beyond this decade, but late 70s educational and science fiction programming, alongside Doctor Who, Star Trek reruns, and experimental late-night broadcasting, contributed to a broader culture in which alternate realities and expanded consciousness could be imagined. The central point is that art did not merely illustrate entheogenic experience. It trained audiences to perceive symbolically, to see body as cosmos, music as ritual, nature as soul, and the image as a possible doorway between ordinary awareness and the visionary unknown. At the same moment, a number of writers and researchers were working to change the vocabulary of psychedelic states. Their intervention would give the era its most enduring term, entheogen. Published in 1978 by R. Gordon Wasson, Albert Hofmann, and Carl A.P. Ruck, The Road to Elysis revolutionized entheogenic history by proposing that the sacred potion called kykeon, used in the ancient Greek Eleusinian mysteries, contained a psychedelic ergot derivative structurally similar to LSD, bridging classical antiquity, modern psychopharmacology, and the academic study of visionary spiritual experience. This text sparked subsequent explorations into the underground roots of religion, influencing works like The Immortality Key by Brian Murarescu and The Psychedelic Gospels by Jerry and Julie Brown. The book also polarized classicists and historians regarding chemical evidence versus traditional ritual interpretation, keeping the discourse on ancient psychopharmacology alive for decades. In January of 1979, Carl A.P. Ruck, Jeremy Bigwood, Danny Staples, Jonathan Ott, and R. Gordon Wasson published the short but influential article Entheogens in the Journal of Psychedelic Drugs. They proposed the word as an alternative to terms such as psychedelic, hallucinogen, and psychotomimetic, which they believed carried assumptions of recreation, deception, madness, or pathology, unsuited to visionary sacraments used in sacred or shamanic settings. The word joined entheos, meaning having a god within, or divinely inspired, with a root related to becoming or coming into being, with the new term typically being rendered as sacraments that have the capacity to generate the divine within. In modern usage, it generally refers to a psychoactive plant or fungi used in a spiritual, religious, or ritual context. This was not merely a public relations substitution. It expressed a theory of interpretation. The meaning of a substance depended substantially on the cultural and ceremonial matrix in which it was used. A peyote meeting in the Native American church, an ayahuasca work in Santo Daime, a Mazatec velada involving psilocybin mushrooms, and an unsupervised party experience might involve overlapping pharmacology, but they were not the same social or spiritual event. Entheogen therefore foregrounded set and setting before those terms became common in contemporary psychedelic discourse. Inner disposition, collective expectations, physical environment, ritual form, authority, music, language, preparation, and the integration that followed all shape experience. It also encouraged scholars to reconsider plants and compounds that had been marginalized by the rhetoric of the drug war. R. Gordon Wasson's earlier account of a mushroom velada with Maria Sabina had brought global attention to Mazatec mushroom practice, but the ensuing attention also disrupted local life and became a cautionary example of how publication, tourism, and fame can burden indigenous ceremonial communities. The 1979 terminology helped create a more respectful scholarly frame, yet respectful language alone could not solve questions of extraction, consent, or cultural ownership. Throughout the late 70s, the entheogen concept thus carried both promise and ambiguity. It defined religious use, but it could also be applied too broadly, making radically different practices appear interchangeable. Its best use remains precise, naming not a magical category of inherently holy chemicals, but a relationship among substance, ceremony, worldview, community, and the quest for contact with what participants regard as sacred. Published in 1979 by Richard Evan Schultes and Albert Hofmann, Plants of the Gods, Their Sacred, Healing, and Hallucinogenic Powers, permanently transformed entheogenic history. It bridges rigorous botanical fieldwork with breakthrough pharmacology, validating indigenous plant use and elevating psychoactive flora from cultural curiosities to profound drivers of human civilization and consciousness. The book framed psychedelic plants as active partners in human evolution and ecological consciousness, and reinforced the framework that these sacred tools are meant to generate the divine within, shifting the cultural narrative away from recreational deviance. The late 70s also saw a quieter revival occurring inside psychotherapy and intimate spiritual networks. One compound in particular, MDMA, began to move from chemical obscurity toward a reputation for empathy, emotional openness, and relational healing. MDMA had been synthesized by Merck in 1912, but it began to be used in psychotherapy during the 1970s, decades before its popular association with nightclub culture and electronic dance music. Unlike classic psychedelics like LSD or psilocybin, MDMA was increasingly described by some advocates as facilitating emotional trust, self-acceptance, communication, and a temporary reduction of fear. Later terminology such as entheogen, often glossed as touching within, and empathogen, attempted to distinguish its characteristic effects from those of the classic serotonergic psychedelics. Therapists and underground guides explored whether MDMA could help people approach grief, trauma, intimacy, and conflict without the same degree of perceptual and symbolic intensity commonly associated with LSD. These practices remained largely outside formal legal medicine, and they should not be romanticized. Unsupervised or medically inappropriate use carries real risks, while therapeutic claims require careful evidence and professional safeguards. Spiritually, however, MDMA widened the 70s conversation. It suggested that the sacred might not arrive only as cosmic vision, archetypal encounter, or ego dissolution. It might also appear as compassion, reconciliation, embodied feeling, truthful speech, and renewed human connection. At the center of this underground stood a different kind of explorer, the independent chemist. Alexander Sasha Shulgin and a network of therapists, researchers, and close collaborators helped sustain a discrete culture of psychoactive inquiry after the official research world had largely withdrawn. Shulgin was a chemist whose work with phenethylamines and tryptamines, as well as related compounds, became foundational to later psychedelic culture. In the period before sweeping analog legislation, he synthesized and self-tested a range of substances, shared findings within trusted circles, and collaborated with psychologists and psychotherapists interested in careful human use. The ethical landscape was complicated. These were not modern clinical trials with the regulatory protections expected in the present, but neither were they always casual experiments. Participants often employed detailed reports, dosage observations, trusted companions, and attempts at responsible screening, creating an informal research culture at the edge of legality. MDMA was especially important because many therapists regarded it as distinct from LSD. Rather than emphasizing overwhelming visual alteration or radical ego dissolution, they reported that it could support emotional clarity, empathy, self-forgiveness, communication, and engagement with difficult memories. By the early 1980s, MDMA had acquired the street name ecstasy, and its use had begun moving beyond therapeutic networks into social and nightlife settings. This transition revealed the unstable boundary between sacrament, medicine, and recreation. A substance used in a quiet therapeutic session, a couple's encounter, a New Age workshop, a Grateful Dead community, or a dance club could produce very different experiences and social meanings. In Texas, including the Dallas area, MDMA entered local nightlife and public attention, helping make the compound a target for federal enforcement. The state's response did not generally distinguish nuanced therapeutic, spiritual, or communal claims from commercial or recreational distribution. As public concern mounted, the question became whether a drug associated with emotional openness and underground therapy would be permitted to enter regulated medicine, or be placed in the same legal category as other prohibited psychedelics. In that sense, MDMA-informed work converged with humanistic psychology, encounter groups, the Esalen Institute environment, body-centered therapies, and the era's aspiration to heal the split between mind, body, and relationship. As 1979 closed, the landscape of entheogenic spirituality had become more diverse than ever. native sacramental continuity, Amazonian religious expansion, controversial theories of ancient mysteries, transpersonal psychology, new pharmacological tools, and a powerful new word for the sacred use of psychoactive sacraments. The next decade would place these currents under greater legal pressure, while new teachers, books, rituals, and underground networks carried them into the 1980s. From 1970 to 1979, entheogenic evidence appears not as one linear movement, but as a network of continuities and reinventions. The Native American Church maintained peyote as a sacrament under conditions of enduring colonial pressure. Mazatec mushroom veladas remained living ceremonial worlds even as global attention complicated their local conditions. Amazonian and Brazilian ayahuasca practices demonstrated that visionary plants could anchor complex religious institutions, not merely isolated mystical episodes. Transpersonal psychology and holotropic breathwork sought non-drug pathways to experiences of death, rebirth, archetype, and transcendence. Neo-shamanism brought practices of trance and spirit journeying into popular Western spirituality, while raising enduring concerns about appropriation and authority. MDMA moved from intimate therapeutic circles toward public prohibition, leaving behind a vision of healing through empathy, vulnerability, and interpersonal truth. The word entheogen, coined in 1979, gave sacred use a durable language, while reminding participants that pharmacology alone cannot define a religious experience. The decade also reveals a recurring pattern. States attempt to control sacraments, but human communities continue to seek meaning through ritual, relationship, and altered awareness. The ethical lesson is not that every intense experience is sacred, nor that every tradition should be open for extraction. It is that claims of revelation must be tested against care for persons, cultures, ecosystems, and truth. Entheogenic practice, at its most mature, asks not what one has seen, but how one lives afterward. It asks whether a vision deepens humility rather than spiritual superiority, reciprocity rather than consumption, and responsibility rather than escape. In our next video, join us as we enter the 1980s, a decade in which entheogenic culture began to move beyond the counterculture and into new forms of scientific, spiritual, and underground exploration. We will follow the revival of psychedelic research, the emergence of new communities and publications, and the continuing dialogue between ancient spiritual systems and modern consciousness exploration. As the 1970s gave way to the new era, the entheogenic story was far from over, and the 1980s would lay important foundations for the psychedelic renaissance to come. Join us next time as we enter the 1980s, a decade of renewed scientific inquiry, underground experimentation, spiritual exploration, and the gradual re-emergence of entheogens in public and academic discourse. Where will our expansive exploration of entheogenic or psychedelic plants, found throughout global spiritual history, take us after the 1980s? Like and subscribe to find out. Thank you for watching. Find more at joinseek.org.